welcome you to this online meeting, European Security and the Role of China and the United States. I'm Yang Li, the Executive Director of the ICES. As far as security is concerned, today, Europe is in a very unique situation. Never before it faces so diverse challenges, and never before there are so many uncertainties. I think security has already become a catchword in European policymaking. Actually, President von der Leyen said on the latest EU diplomats conference that, I quote, "Security must become the organizing principle of our action," unquote. So under such circumstances, how Europe perceives and addresses its security concerns is not only a matter concerned by the European citizens, but also has an impact on the global geopolitical landscape. And the interactions between Europe and the two other major powers in the world, namely China and the United States, also comes up as an important factor shaping that European security policy and has implications for the long-term and overall strategic stability worldwide. So today, we are going to hear opinions, first of all, from European perspective. We have two European speakers. And also we're going to learn China's point of view. Of course, when we talk about security, we cannot ignore the role of the United States. However, today we will not have Americans speaking for Americans because of the time limit. But make sure that today's event is only part of the dialogue. The ICES will surely organize more upcoming events, which will have American speakers or speakers from the United States engaged. So please follow our announcements and invitations closely, and I welcome you to participate either in person or online to our future events. So now allow me to introduce today's distinguished panel of speakers. First, Amanda Paul, Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Center, EPC. She has well-established expertise on issues related to Ukraine, Turkey, EU enlargement, and broader security issues. Second is Professor Cui Hongjian. He's the professor and director of the Center for the EU and Regional Development Studies of Beijing Foreign Studies University. And he's specialized on international politics and regional governance, Chinese foreign affairs, European politics, economy, and security issues. And then Andrea Hartel, head of Brussels office of German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP. His research focus includes Ukraine, European neighborhood policy, and European security order. Last but not least, Yan Shaohua, Deputy Director and Associate Professor at the Center for China-Europe Relations, Fudan University of China. His research interests include EU politics and foreign policy, China-EU relations, and economic security. And it's worthwhile to mention that he recently published a book on European strategic autonomy. Now, before I turn to the speakers, I will just announce the rules for today. So I will invite each of the speakers to speak for no more than 8 to 10 minutes, and then I will have some follow-up questions to the speakers. About 15 to 20 minutes will be allocated for Q&A from the audience. So in order for the speakers to answer as more questions as possible within a short time, so please feel free, I suggest you feel free to submit your questions via the chat box so that we can save more time for the speakers to answer your questions. And also later during the Q&A session, you could raise your hand using the react function on Zoom. So the host will invite you to turn on your camera and pose your question. But before that, please kindly remain muted when the speakers are talking. Now I will start my questions. My questions to all the speakers. What are the current and long-term security challenges confronting Europe? To what extent conflicts in other parts of the world affect European security? How can Europe establish a security architecture to protect its own security, and to use the terms of some European statesmen, project power globally. Will Europe choose to strengthen a European pillar within the current transatlantic alliance, such as NATO? Or is it more likely that European Union will establish an independent defense mechanism? How will China and the United States seek to influence that development of European security design, if they intend to do that? So that is the question. First of all, I will give the floor to Amanda. So let's hear your views on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Li Yang, and thank you for having me today. I think it would actually take me an hour to answer all of your questions, so I'll try to limit myself perhaps to one or two. I mean, first of all, when we look at the security situation in the globe, but also within Europe's neighborhood, I would say it's actually a now or never moment for Europeans to get their game together, to prove themselves to be an effective geopolitical and security actor. I mean, I think this is really the time where Europe needs to act. I mean, if we look at the short-term security challenges, I mean, obviously, Russia's war in Ukraine is the #1 challenge. This is seen as an immediate threat to European security and stability. It's an existential threat, and it's a European war. Sometimes it's framed as just a Ukrainian war, but this is not the correct way to look at it. This is a war in Europe. It's a war that is not just a conventional war. I mean, Russia is carrying out this war in a hybrid format. The conventional war that you see on the battlefield in Ukraine, but also we're seeing interventions into Europe. We've seen different drone attacks in member states on critical infrastructure and whatnot. Also, we are seeing cyber attacks across Europe, as well as large-scale disinformation campaigns throughout all of the EU, including election interference. So it would be extremely short-sighted to say this is just a war in Ukraine that can be contained in Ukraine and it has nothing to do with the rest of Europe. This is absolutely nonsense. This is a European war. So the war in Ukraine is a #1 security threat to Europe without any question. The second threat, I would say, is actually the US's evolving role when it comes to European security. We've seen the US evolve from a partner, a strategic partner and reliable ally for decades into the complete opposite. President Trump has made it very clear that he now expects Europeans to be mainly responsible for their own security, that the United States wants to focus primarily on the Western Hemisphere in the Indo-Pacific and provide very limited support to Europe alongside the conventional nuclear deterrence. But it still remains very unclear what the future of the US role is going to be in European security, and also some of the policies that have been carried out by Washington over the last few months have been deeply concerning. I mean, not just for Europe, probably for the rest of the world, including the operation in Venezuela to remove the president, then President Trump's approach towards Greenland, basically saying he wanted to buy Greenland or was ready to take it by force. I mean, that didn't happen or hasn't happened yet, but this was something very extreme for Europeans. And more recent, the situation around Cuba, as well as the now ongoing US-Israeli war on Iran, which seems to have no clear track towards an end. I mean, all of these things are impacting on European security. And of course, this takes place against a bigger picture of a conflict-ridden world where we're seeing the erosion of multilateralism and the rules-based system. So all of these things are very difficult for Europe. So they've had to completely evolve the way that they do things. I mean, Europe is now taking more responsibility for its own security, but we're coming basically from a ground zero level and being expected to go to 100 in a very short period of time. So there are clearly many defense readiness gaps when it comes to Europe's ability to be able to defend itself. This is a reflection of the underinvestment in military capabilities for many years, but this is slowly improving. We now see that member states are investing much more in their defense capabilities and working much closer together. But perhaps we can go into that a bit more later. The issue of economic security is also now a big deal for Europe. I mean, the protection of critical infrastructure, I mean, energy, digital, transport, but also economic security chains, I mean, supply chains that have become weaponized over the last few years. So trade dependencies and supply chains, the Europeans are looking at this again and trying to prioritize relationships with, we use the term like-minded partners. I'm not a big fan of that, but looking to evolve so they're not dependent on one party. I mean, we had that situation with Russia when it came to energy, but they're not alone. Also now, Europe is operating to look for a more power-based economic order, critical raw materials through the resource EU and the action plan. I mean, they're coming up with new initiatives, how they can have more diverse sources for critical raw materials around the world. And as I just mentioned, again, on energy security, again, the war in the Middle East has exposed how dependent Europeans are still on very few sources. They have reduced the dependence on Russian gas, but not totally, and this still remains a priority, but also defending against the vulnerability to supply shocks and infrastructure shortages, which is what we've seen. I mean, if you look to the longer term priorities of the EU, then we're talking about strategic autonomy to replace reliance on the US and other partners. So strategic autonomy has become a priority. Further developing our ability to have independent defense capabilities. But the challenge to these initiatives remain fragmentation within Europe. I mean, Europe has a lot of security threats from outside, but also what's going on internally in Europe is also a challenge. I mean, there has been a trend of increasing far-right politicians or governments, either within governments or within parliaments, and this has proven to be a challenge, but also diverging national interests across the EU member states, which has made it more difficult to have unified responses. I guess that everybody in the audience knows that most EU decision making is done on unanimity. That requires all 27 member states to agree on something. There have been some calls to move to QMV, but to get to QMV, you need to have unanimity to agree to that. So this is not the case. So there's a lot of, creative thinking going on within the EU, how they can resolve this, because it has created problems when one or two member states blocks an initiative. I mean, we've seen, for example, coalitions of the willings or groups of countries who are ready to move forward on certain initiatives themselves. But probably I'm running out of my 8 minutes, so I just want to end this short intervention by coming back to the issue of Ukraine, because how the war in Ukraine ends will be central to defining the future of Europe's security environment. And so it needs to end in a way that is not favorable to Russia. A Ukrainian defeat of the aggressor and a just and sustainable peace that maintains Ukraine's sovereignty would reshape, first of all, modern warfare lessons, but it would also bring security and stability to Europe and beyond. If we see a situation for one reason or another, and perhaps we can get into this in the discussion, where Ukraine is forced into some sort of badly negotiated deal, or we end with a frozen conflict, or the Russians manage to secure some sort of victory, this will have long-term implications for European security. I mean, first of all, it would risk eliminating Ukraine as a state in the worst case scenario. But beyond that, allowing Russia to be seen in any way successful in this war of aggression that it started will be viewed by different actors around the world as a signal that aggression actually can achieve results, which could result in actually further conflicts around the world. This is why it's important to ensure that we have a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine, for Europe, first of all for Ukraine, but for Europe, to deter other actors around the world who may try and do that. But first of all, to ensure security and stability on the European continent, and to actually demonstrate that the Europeans can be effective actors in bringing about security and stability on their own continent.
Okay, thank you, Amanda, for giving a very comprehensive sketch of the security threats faced by Europe, and also the difficulties both in addressing them, both from outside and from within. So, and surely we will come back to Ukraine later. I think there are a lot of specific issues to be discussed. Now I will give the floor to Professor Cui Hongjian. So let's hear your view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and also all of his colleagues, especially from the European side. It's a very, very good opportunity. I think we exchange some observations on the very, very important issue is how about the security challenges towards Europe. And especially if we take all of this, recent changes from Ukraine to Greenland to the Iran now, undoubtedly there will be more and more problem for kind of a global security dilemma. So how could we, especially for both China and Europe, because now among all of these major players, firstly Russia and then United States, they try to deal with some issues by using of military force, and they try to change or reshape the world order in their own interests. But now the big problem is where the interests, especially security interests, for both China and Europe, because so far we don't do anything in this kind of I would like to say destructive approach. So how could we protect our interests? And then how could we try to promote, indeed, the environment for us? I think that the recent, wars or conflicts showcased very, very obviously this kind of description of this Munich Security Conference about now we are facing the wrecking ball-like destructive force to, damage the whole water, and we have to suffer something from this destruction of the water. Regarding to some questions from Mr. Yang, I think this time undoubtedly the very big challenges to Europe is it's difficult to take a difference between so-called long-term security challenge and a short-term security challenge. Because I think the problem is, yes, for short-term, European side should do something to try to manage the crisis and to keep distance from some wars or conflicts, especially Iran or Middle East. Just like what happened now for most of the European countries did. Try to keep distance from American military actions and try to find out the, its own, namely, so third way to deal with this, conflict or war in Middle East. But at the same time, how could the European side to get a long time, resources, and especially very, substantial consensus from inside to support this long time crisis management process? I think it's a dilemma. For short term, yes, crisis management, but for long time should be a constructive process, which means that okay, we need a sustainable European security architecture. But now the problem is, where is the starting point for this long time sustainable security architecture for Europe? So I think it shows some very, embarrassing situation for Europe, because Europe could not do something more to decide itself its own fate. Okay, because this time there was no any information from Washington towards any capital cities in Europe for this Iran war. So European side has to accept the result objectively. I think it's a very big difficulties for Europe. Another, of course, a long-time problem is how could the European Union, how could the NATO, especially European member states in the NATO, to find out the real consensus. So far, even after 2 or 3 weeks for the Iran war, we still find out the diversity of stands for all of the member states of the European Union. Some countries will try to give some support to American military actions. Some other criticized seriously against the actions taken by Washington and Israel. So I think it also undermines the possible or potential role for European side to play in this diplomatic approach, because there is no consensus, there is no common ground on how about the nature of that military action by United States, and how about the final solution for Iran nuclear issue and also Middle East security issue. So once there is not common ground consensus on the war, certainly there will not be consensus or common ground for how could the European side play a more active role to help diplomatic solutions. So I think security diplomatic, military diplomatic, those two, so far, I think it's become a very conflicting issues. Ideally, I think it could be a very important and useful two instruments for European side. But now, unfortunately, military or diplomatic approach become a very difficult choice for European side. And yes, as we now always listen to years, we try to concern about how about the possible change for the current situation and or even security system or architecture for Europe. It looks like now the NATO and the European Union, which one will play a more dominating role to help this long-time sustainable security achievement in Europe. But so far, I think now very, very big problem. Just like Madam Paul mentioned that how could the European side to deal with two conflicts or two wars at the same time? According to my understanding, for a long time, it could be a nightmare for European side to find out it has to deal with so-called Russian threat from east or from north. At the same time, European has to deal with any threat from Middle East side, including terrorism, including this migration issue or some other. But now, if we look at the current situation, unfortunately, European country and the European Union and the European continental now is in the situation. It has to deal with two conflicts or two wars at the same time. So it will give some, indeed, more and more so far spillover effects. If we look at this, very, very bad situation for the energy security for European side, and especially how the potential damage on its trade. If we look at the Red Sea or the Hormuz Strait or some other. So now I think this security situation for Europe is not just for Ukraine, not just for Iran, is a kind of systemic threats or challenges. So if we go back to how could we do something together? Firstly, we need to understand, yes, perhaps China and Europe, we do have some different understand on the Ukrainian conflict or war. But undoubtedly, I think on this Iran war, we will have some more similar or even common stance. If we look at what happened for the past, Israel and Hamas conflicts, even for that issue, China and some European countries, we are trying to find out some more common grounds. And even at this moment, at the very beginning of the Iran war, China and France, they also try to have a strategic dialogue or strategic exchange to find out the common grounds. So now the big question, just like also Paul mentioned, that European Union not yet or doesn't play a proper role to help this strategic exchange with China. Now the major issue or priority of policy for European Union is to find free relations with China and trade, investment, technology, everything. So I think it gives a very frustrating situation for China. Even China wants to try to get some more exchange with the European side. But now so far, yes, just China and France. Those two big countries say that, okay, we need to exchange views, we need to find out the common grounds, but not the most of the European countries. I think it gives a very, very embarrassing situation for this, potential cooperation between China and Europe. Also, we understand once there are some more and more spillover effect for energy security, for some other, trade channel or some other, both China and Europe, we are the biggest losers. Indeed. Now the situation is Russia and the United States, they are trying to take use of military force to win the more advantages in this so-called gaming between major players. Comparing with those two major powers, how about China and Europe? We have been forced into a more difficult situation. If we look at our, dependence of oil and gas, not only on Middle East and also some other, regions. So I would like to stop here and waiting for more exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cui, to analyze that some of the difficulties China is facing when they want to enhance security communications with Europe, especially the consensus building within Europe, as pointed out by the previous speaker. Thank you, and we will come back more for your points. Then I will give floor to Andrew Hartel. So let's hear your views about that. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning or good afternoon to China. Thank you, Yang Li, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to work together with ESAS. I'm very proud of the cooperation we have developed so far, and I'm looking to the future with a lot of hope, for more substantial things to come up. I have prepared a short input, and I would start with the challenges for European security as I see it here from Brussels. I think we are faced currently here in Europe with three major authoritarian powers questioning the international order. Russia is already leading an aggressive war against Europe in Ukraine since 2022. The US has questioned the international order in Greenland with direct, basically territorial consequences for, or potential territorial consequences for Europe, in Venezuela and the Middle East. And it is positioning itself, at least the Trump administration, so the country's leadership, against the European political mainstream. Then China, in a more gradual way, also challenges the current international order. It assists, to some degree at least, Russian efforts in Ukraine. And it has, from the position of Brussels, an uncooperative geo-economic approach, which kind of favors absolute gains over relative gains. And the simple threat Europeans are fearing from this Chinese approach is that they will get out-manufactured. Their industries will die. So, in a nutshell, the security situation for Europe has never been that bad since the Second World War. Especially the fragility, this is an euphemism from my point. I would talk much more about, I guess, the shattering of the transatlantic alliance, and the distrust inside the NATO alliance is critical here. So, without overemphasizing too much, I think that currently Europe, among the major powers, has no natural ally. There's a very strong feeling here that we are now on our own. What are our options? What are European options? One is bandwagoning. So what we have been doing the last decades, especially with the US, but at a much higher price. Basically giving in to the radical transactionalism Donald Trump promotes in the relationship between Europe and the US. Then sovereignty and the development of strategic autonomy, the development, in fact, of Europe into an own pole in the international system. I will talk about this a little bit later. And the third option, the Armageddon option, as I call it, is disintegration and the emulation of unstructured multipolarity we see in the world in Europe, which would, of course, in the final consequence, pose Europeans against each other, European member states of the European Union, and lead to an end of the peace process. European integration has been in the last decades. Now, to turn a little bit more towards the optimistic and positive side, my second part, towards more European sovereignty, what has been done and what's left to do. I think, to start on a very optimistic note, Europe has shown unprecedented resolve and unity in Ukraine. The Europeans have transferred over 200 billion euros in weapons, in economic help, in humanitarian help. It has taken over as the major supporter for Ukraine from the US already last year. It has come up with instruments such as training missions with the European Peace Facility, basically via the European Union refinancing national weapons deliveries to Ukraine. All of this has been unthinkable for the European Union to do for a third state, not for a member state, before 2022. Ukraine, I guess this is safe to say, would not be the same territorially now without Europe's support. And I think Europe has also a plan. It has a strategy. This is basically a double strategy, I would call it, of finding new partnerships in the world on the one hand, and ensuring the finalization of the single market, its competitiveness and thereby attractiveness in the world by implementing the so-called Draghi report. Especially on finding new partnerships in the world, we have seen a lot of successes in the last 1 or 2 years. The security partnerships with South Korea and Japan, the new free trade agreements with Mercosur, with India, and others which are currently under negotiation. We just this week finalized a trade agreement with the Australians. To these come successful rearmament projects driven by the European Union, such as ReArm, worth 800 billion euros, SAFE, and EDIP, which are already underway, and numerous policy field initiatives, such as, for example, the 12 AI gigafactories the European Union, the Commission will co-finance together with public money, which is a way, of course, to strengthen our strategic autonomy also in different spheres, such as the digital sphere. But after all those positive developments, one has to also become quite clear about the shortcomings and weaknesses. And I guess here Ukraine is a case in point, because next to all the positive developments, this has been, and one needs to say this very clearly, the only critical field or the only critical theater where unity has for a long time prevailed in the European Union, now for almost 4 years. This is not at all the case in other critical portfolios, such as Gaza, China, or you mentioned the war in Iran. Second, our resources are now more than exhausted, or almost exhausted. We have seen that with the debate about the Euroclear, the Russian assets at Euroclear, that the German government was so eager to get them out of Belgium. Was basically the reason for this was basically that we have governments in Europe, especially the German government, have increasingly problems convincing their public that taxpayers' money should be transferred in these dimensions to Ukraine further. Now we have a blockade by Hungary. This has happened a few times already. But I guess we are at a very critical point here, because I don't see much of a way to transfer the 90 billion euros before the summer to Ukraine, before it gets critical. This will have consequences on the battlefield. We also have not been able, despite all the money we shifted and the weapons we shifted to Ukraine, to take over from the US in escalation management and strategy-wise. The EU, Europeans are not a participant to negotiations, and never have there been more civilians dying in Ukraine after Donald Trump gave up on escalation management after his own inauguration. We haven't found an answer on that as Europeans. Therefore, our biggest problem at the moment is our capacity to act decisively in the world in the face of a lack of unity. What are we doing about this? There are discussions going on. Amanda mentioned this about coalitions of the willing, a European Security Council, about vanguard coalitions or even vanguard states. So states which have a stable government and fiscal space. And there's only one member state currently which is big enough, has fiscal space and a stable government. This is Germany. My plea for the Europeans in the next 2 or 3 years would be to focus on pragmatism and priorities. I think that, of course, by giving some member states the room for advancing, for going ahead with certain things, such as rearmament or finding a joint approach towards major crises, comes with the risk of a certain loosening or further disintegration of European unity. But we have no other choice. How do the institutions fit into this? The institutions, I think, should not focus so much on big, ambitious projects like a European Defense Union or a European army. Efforts in this direction should go on, but they will maybe win the next war for Europeans, not the war in front of us. For the moment, the institutions should, in my mind, focus on one part of this double strategy, namely implementing the Draghi report, for which there's much more unity between the 27 than on other things. I close with, do I still have a minute? I close with Ukraine. I guess it's very important for external powers, for external observers to understand, as Amanda said, that, just a second, that for Europeans, this is the most eminent security threat. And that Ukraine is, in our minds, the first line in our defense against the Russian ambition to reverse hegemony over Europe. And this has become this threat to us, a reversal of hegemony over Europe, currently an American hegemony, has become even more critical for us after Trump's increasing collusion with the Kremlin. If we will not manage to hold off Russians in Ukraine, others will notice, and the specter of disintegration of the European Union in case of defeat is, to my mind, very evident. The war in Ukraine structures also our perspective on security as such, and it finds itself automatically, so Europe finds itself automatically in opposition to Russia's direct and tacit supporters. That means, first of all, Iran, North Korea, but also to some degree, China. We cannot decouple geopolitical from geoeconomic questions here. And despite, and this is where I come now to the connection to the Iran theater, despite strong case-related disagreements between Europeans and the US, the Europeans might be forced, in order to have support, to keep the support of the US in Ukraine, to hook up with the US also in other theaters. Look at Secretary General Rutte's very strong play for a European role on the side of Americans in the war against Iran. Europeans after Iran need to assume that negotiation efforts with Putin over Ukraine are on ice, and that Putin's line will harden for the moment. He benefits temporarily from the war in Ukraine, geopolitically, geoeconomically, with the oil price. Western resources on the other side and attention are much more stretched at the moment. Europe thus needs to double down and prepare for an even longer war strategically. Should not get distracted, should try to focus on Ukraine. It should give Russia no easy wins. We already had certain signs by the Belgian prime minister, for example. He wanted to negotiate, he wanted to speak to Putin, that the situation in Iran could lead to a rapprochement to giving in easily in Ukraine. But I think the Russians, or what should determine our short-term actions, is still what happens on the battlefield. And currently, the Russians are not very successful on the battlefield. We should focus on what happens there instead of too much looking at the very fluid consequences of what happens in other geopolitical theaters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, for giving us an outline of possible scenarios and solutions for Europeans to address its current security challenges and also its kind of interactions with other major powers of the world. So we'll come back to that later. So now I will give the floor to the Yan Shaohua. Please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Yang Li, for the kind. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I see we already talked for about 40 minutes, so I will try to be shorter, and I will try to make 3 brief points. The first thing I'd like to say is that I think it is time for China and Europe to talk about security. You know, the traditional narrative in China-Europe relation is that in China and Europe, we don't have strategic conflict of interests, and that is what distinguishes China-Europe relations from China-US relations, right? But somehow I think this traditional narrative is kind of being tested, which I have also brought this point in my article back in 2021, because both China and Europe are getting closer to each other's geographically sensitive area. For example, for Europe, China is coming closer to Europe via Western Balkans or via its relationship with Russia. And for China, Europe is getting closer to the Indo-Pacific through the EU and a number of its member states Indo-Pacific strategy. So this is the reality. This relationship is becoming more and more securitized. And I think it's time for us to talk about security. And somehow some level of securitization is not necessarily bad for a comprehensive strategic partnership, which the two sides established back in 2003. And we see that recently, you mentioned that yesterday or several days ago, a Chinese delegation from the Defense Ministry visited Brussels and held talks with EEAS and also including NATO. I think this is a right step. This is a step in the right direction. So this is fourth point I'd like to say. Number 2, regarding the security challenges, long-term security challenges that Europe is facing, I think the biggest challenge for Europe is that now a hot war is coming back to European soil. At a time when the US is disengaging in Europe, but Europe itself is not ready, it's not capable enough to defend itself. I think that is the biggest challenge in the sense that the security order has fundamentally changed on the European continent. So it's not just about the Ukraine war. I think the Ukraine war, it's maybe only the beginning of that fundamental change. It's a prelude or a kind of catalyst for a deeper and more fundamental change in European security order. And I think that is a deeper challenge. Currently, I think Europe is kind of in a crisis mode, and somehow that is, blinding Europe from thinking about the longer term challenges. And I think it is time to think about this deeper and more fundamental challenge that Europe is facing. And so what kind of response or what kind of options does Europe have? I think the first option is to strengthen Europe's defense autonomy, which I think is not a choice but a necessity for Europe. You mentioned either this could be done by strengthening the European pillar within NATO. This is, I think, more feasible in the short term, but I think in the longer term, Europe should prepare for, a Europe without America, or European security order without America engagement. But of course, Europe also has to do its own homework, in particular, in reforming the decision-making, the unanimity-based decision-making mechanism in foreign and security policy. Because in this more, what President von der Leyen said, a hyper-competitive and hyper-transactional world, Europe is too slow to move and too weak to get things done. So I think that is also badly needed. I think in this kind of geopolitical era, the thing is to get things done. I think which is more important rather than how to get it done. And I think fundamentally, the fundamental question for Europe is to it's a lack of leadership, and I think that's the fundamental problem. And in the past, that kind of leadership has been provided by the United States somehow, but I think that assumption does not hold anymore, right? So this leadership has to come from somewhere else. And I think Brussels is not yet in a position to provide that leadership. And I think the EU or European states does not have to do everything through the EU framework. I think if the EU doesn't, provide the kind of leadership, then somebody else, some member states, have to stand out and provide that leadership. And this could be done by, the other speakers have already talked about this, by a coalition of the willing, or somehow a two-speed Europe, which I think is also happening. Yeah, and let's see. I think, of course, this will somehow come at the cost of unity within, or some kind of disintegration within the European Union. But it could also be a positive catalyst for, a more, bold reform that is badly needed in the EU, either in defense or in economic integration, etc. So I will stop here and look forward to further discussions.
Thank you, Yan Shaohua, to pointing out the current, one of the biggest challenges facing European Union is that how to, formulate that kind of security, or even a broader strategy for it to have real strategic autonomy. So that's that's some of the fundamental problem. Okay, so now I will have some questions prepared for each of the speakers. I think first of all is about Ukraine. I think both European speakers they pointed out that this is the most pressing issue and most imminent threat to European security, and also the resolution of this conflict is something very important for the direction of the European security architecture will take. So, but there's so could Amanda and Andrew talk about a little bit how do you foresee that the war will end? Especially when there are a lot of things happening in the world, and also the U.S. is changing its positions and is turning more transactional, and it's likely that there will be kind of a frozen conflict or frozen peace, which might lead to further wars in European continent. So how do you foresee that likelihood? And there's any timeline for the war to end very soon? Maybe Amanda first, and then followed by Andrew.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, to be honest, a frozen peace or a frozen conflict would be a very bad outcome, to be quite honest. I mean, we know from the past, whenever territory is frozen, at least I'm talking about in the Russian case, we've seen that previously with Crimea and the war that Russia started back in 2014 in the Donbass, when Russia was basically allowed to maintain control over frozen territory. It only ends with another phase of the war. And this would almost certainly be the outcome if we end up in a situation where the war is frozen, or a situation where Ukraine is forced to cede territory, which has been a request that came from President Trump and President Putin. This is not a solution. This is just a step that would lead to a pause in the war while the Russians would regroup and rearm. Because we need to be very clear that anybody who follows Russian news or President Putin's statements, his objectives have not changed. You can read that every day. His objectives are to have a successful military operation in Ukraine that would lead to Russian control over the country, the change of leadership in the country, in which would be extremely detrimental for the future of a sovereign Ukraine to start with, but also for Europe. But I mean, the bigger picture goes well beyond Ukraine, because for the Russians, this is a war against the West, something that has been played out for many years. Its end goal is also viewed by President Putin as restoring Russia's global supremacy as a major global actor in the world. I mean, this is the bigger picture of Russia's objectives, so that it goes beyond Ukraine, beyond Europe. If I was going to be really cynical, I would say that it's actually a war that's very much targeted towards the United States and the West more general, which is why it's crucial that the war ends with a sustainable and just solution. This should mean that Ukraine is not forced into giving up territory. This is not a solution. This would be a gift. There should be a ceasefire that happens as soon as possible, hopefully, but under the right conditions, where we would see a sustainable process towards a future peace agreement that would not favor the Russian Federation. I mean, so far what's been put on the table, I mean, the plan that was initiated by the Americans with then some input from the Europeans, it's still very far from being finalized or agreed on. I mean, the Russians, who are probably the best negotiators in the world, I mean, anyone that's ever sat down with Russian diplomats or negotiators can tell you they can negotiate for hours and hours and hours, and then you understand that you haven't agreed on anything. So Russia is not in a position, or is not ready at the moment, to seriously talk about ending the war. And why would Moscow be? At the moment, unfortunately, the position of the United States is very favorable to the Russians. I mean, President Putin looks at this like a business transaction. Of course, he's very frustrated because he seemed to believe we could end the war in a very short period of time. That's not happening. And despite the fact that Ukraine is in a very difficult position, they are not going to accept any deal that would lead to basically the capitulation of their country. From the Europeans, unfortunately, are still not projecting power, as was mentioned by Andre. They don't have a seat at the table. They haven't been able to get a seat at the table. And probably the only way they're going to be able to achieve this is if they can put something forward very meaningful in terms of what they would be actually willing to do to help implement or secure a ceasefire. That would be viewed as the Americans as something important. Whether that would be deploying a deterrence force, a reassurance force into Ukraine post-ceasefire, or taking responsibility for monitoring a potential ceasefire on the Black Sea, could be one of two options. But certainly Europeans need to further step up. As what we've seen so far, there's still a lot of indecisiveness. There's still this overriding risk aversion. I mean, Europeans are risk adverse to doing anything that may escalate with the Russians. I mean, personally, I think they shouldn't be thinking about this, because this is what the Russians actually want them to do. They shouldn't be worried about putting forward proposals that the Russians may not like. I mean, we're not here to please the Kremlin. So ultimately, Europe needs to do much more, and it needs to step up. I believe another impediment in this process is that Europeans are far too fixated on the upcoming midterm elections in the US. Despite everything that has happened, despite the evolution of US foreign policy and approach towards Europe, I personally don't think that Europeans have fully come to terms with the fact that the United States, that we knew and loved for many years, has gone, and will probably gone forever. There's no point in having wishful thinking that Trump, the Republicans are going to be wiped out by the midterms, and that the next proper elections will bring back, something more agreeable. This is the wrong way to approach this. Even if the midterms do reduce the seats of the Republicans, this doesn't necessarily mean a bigger change. And also, we can see that President Trump is already personally campaigning for midterms, which are usually more of a local affair. So Europeans should be focused on the bigger picture and on increasing their own ability to be important security actors, focused on getting a seat at the table, and focused on delivering what they actually promised to Ukraine. Because from a Ukrainian perspective, they don't like the new policy of the White House, but they've come to terms with it. And they've managed to start to engage with Washington in a way that is more acceptable or accommodating for the US. For Europeans, the fact that they aren't able to still effectively deliver the necessary weapons to Ukraine in a timely fashion, or the economic assistance that is vital. I mean, Ukraine will run out of money in a couple of months. This is the state of affairs. Is deeply disappointing, because as Europeans continue to repeat, the war in Ukraine is a priority for their security. I still don't think this is effectively reflected in the approach. But just to come back to how this war should end, as I mentioned before, it needs to end in a just and sustainable fashion, where we would see Ukraine's territory ideally returned to Ukraine in its entirety. That might be a big achievement, but this should be the goal, where we would see European security effectively working to secure the continent, but also working in tandem with Ukraine's security. Ukraine has developed an amazing defense sector. I'm sure everybody here is aware of it. They're basically the world leaders now in innovative drone technology, among other things. So Ukraine itself can be the main security guarantor for a peace settlement. Europeans will be in the second rung, but this is very much a back seat. They won't be guaranteeing Ukraine's security in the first lane. So they need to commit and double down to this, and these security guarantees need to be robust, because an end to this war and a final solution will only be successful if it is read by the Kremlin as being so strong that they will not dare to invade Ukraine or any other territory again. And I think this is important, not just for Europe, but actually for many other countries around the world. And just to maybe say a last word about China. I mean, China has carried out some diplomatic efforts. I would say you would probably say they've been a neutral diplomatic actor. I would say that in many cases they tend to amplify a pro-Russian stance. I think China could be more active and more active in a neutral way. I mean, I fully understand that China has important ties with Russia that have increased during the scope of this war. But still, there are areas where more could be done, and particularly given the fact that in the sort of post-war era, China already has pretty good relations with Ukraine, to be fair, given everything, but there'll be many opportunities to have a role in reconstruction and Ukraine's recovery. And I do know that the Chinese friends would like to have a role in this beyond what they're already doing. So it would be nice to see perhaps a bigger role of China in terms of supporting a just and sustainable end to the war, which I think would have tangible benefits for Beijing and for Ukraine and for other actors in Europe that are Chinese partners.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. So now, Andrew, could you have some maybe a brief words to say about that?
Yes, I mean, what can I add to Amanda's perspective? Maybe, you know, what I do not like too much, or I think what is a little bit what would blindside us at the moment is to talk too much about negotiations, about ceasefire, and a possible peace agreement between Ukraine and the Russians. I don't think that this war shows any signs of coming to an end very soon. Both sides are not exhausted. The Russians are not exhausted. They're heavily invested into this war. Putin has turned this war into has connected it to the raison d'être, of his regime and of Russia itself as a concept in the world. And I think the negotiations, if one can call them so, during the last, let's say, roughly 1 year, they haven't been led in good faith by the Russians. They have done this foremost in order to please Donald Trump and to get more breathing space in what they do in Ukraine, at least from the US side. I don't see that beyond the exchange of prisoners here and then, anything substantial has come out of this negotiation so far. So I don't think this is the right framing, and that this puts us as Europeans into the right mindset for what's to come here. Putin is operating currently, let's be very frank about this, on a very conducive geopolitical picture. We have no order in the world. Even if we speak about multipolarity, this is not a multipolar order. It's multipolar confusion. And Putin is able to play that to his advantage at the moment in a very sophisticated way. But on the other hand, this kind of disorder, multipolar disorder, if you want to call it so, is very fluid, right? It can also turn against him in any other moment. What the Europeans should do is, I liked what Ursula von der Leyen has coined the term, I think last year or the year before, the porcupine strategy. So trying to, in the long term, in the mid and long term also, bolster Ukraine as much as possible so it can withstand this war and the Russian advance for years to come. This is just, this might be a very kind of bad reality, but it just corresponds with what's going on in the overall geopolitical picture, the multipolar disorder. Where is the point for the Russians to agree on something really sustainable? Yeah? To basically give up their claim on, in the long term, dominating Ukraine in the current circumstances, in the current geopolitical circumstances. What we might get, what we might see in Ukraine during the next 2 or 3 years is different phases of this conflict, which will but still remain hot. Yeah? We won't get this is my best guess. We won't get at the safe situation, at a very clear situations where the Russians sign an agreement which basically puts European troops in the free Ukraine, where we have a contact line where the Russians withdraw from several, maybe 100 kilometers with heavy weapons. So something we can rely on. I don't think that this will materialize. The most likely scenario is if we get something paraphrased with the Russians, Putin will try everything to hold the situation at the same time for the rest of Ukraine, for what remains of Ukraine, very much open for himself. So we should prolong for a very long war, which can see very different phases, and where we need to go on as Europeans to bolster Ukraine as much as we can.
Okay, thank you. So it seems that this kind of Ukrainian war is still, you will hold for a period of time. So it's not very likely to resolve in the very near future. So now I will turn to Chinese speakers. So how do you think about, the China's role in ending this conflict? And also China is always talking about this as to be related to a setup of a sustainable European security architecture. So what kind of security architecture would it look like from China's perspective? And also, the previous speakers also talked about, the kind of, how to say, for example, the European security architecture, like the multi-speed Europe or the European Security Council, and also coalition of the winning. So how do you think that will influence the EU's security relationship with China? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Or how China would think this kind of, would like to see this kind of architecture look like? Thank you. So maybe Professor Cui first and then Yan Shaohua.
Okay, thank you. Especially still, I think a very interesting discussion. But before I try to answer a question from our chair, I want to also share some of my feeling about the previous discussion, especially from our European counterparts. Recent years, for a long time, as we know, always for European Union, it tried to have a kind of a principle pragmatism. Foreign policy and security policy. But frankly, I understand that now it's a little bit easier in Brussels to find out, firstly, what's our principle, especially when we talk about China, when we talk about security or even competition. If we can find out something from Mr. Andrews' presentation, you can find that. We need to find, firstly, political stance. China, is becoming more and more the challenge or even threat to European Union or to Europe, not only because of economic competition, especially this kind of accusation that China is supporting Russia. Frankly, even as a scholar, I don't accept any accusation without any evidence and also a chain of logic about this. Just like Amanda mentioned that for both Ukraine and Russia, China is the biggest trading partner. So if we can also accept the accusation from the Russian side to say, China, you are supporting Ukraine because you sell too much to Ukraine, it's fair? I don't think it's fair. Okay. Another, I think, a very, very big issue is, I understand that yes, there has been, so many, perfect design for strategy, for regulations recent years from Brussels. But now the big question for European security is, there is no way, there is no timing, there is no space for European side to implement so many beautiful strategies. Okay? Another, I think, a very, very important issue is not China to change its stance on Ukrainian crisis. It's the United States. It's the United States to give so big uncertainties for European security. This time, once again, is the United States to give another big shock to European side that you have to suffer from this higher and higher price of oil and gas because of Iran and the Middle East. So I agree with Andrew that so far now there is no major alliances for Europe. But another I would like to add is there is no nature enemy or rivals for Europe. So why don't always, as a natural response, always put China as a negative factor for your security or some other issue? I understand you do have some still psychological perhaps factors to easily to find out China as a target, to have some more criticize and to have some negative perception and some other. But frankly, please go back to the realities. Please go back to the facts. Regarding to, I would like to say, now it's time for China and Europe. We should have some more serious discussion, if it's possible, that we can do something together to help the situation in Ukraine. If you have a long time observation about the Chinese foreign policy, especially recently, the Foreign Minister Wang met with his counterpart in Ukraine, in Munich. If we find that China also try to find out a more balancing, position on this issue, once there will be some more, I think, serious and sensual discussion between China and Europe, it could be helpful for Europe to find out the approach to be part of a negotiation finally, and to take a seat around the table, not just like this one. Yes, want to be part of a negotiation, but there is no any allowance from United States. So I think, frankly, yes, because I really want to say that we do have a lot of potential for cooperation on security, not only for Ukraine, not only for Iran, for Middle East, and also for real sustainable security architecture in Europe. But now the big question, big problem is, I think especially European Union or some member states, they have to choose a kind of I would like to say a hypocritical and also selfish stance to deal with it. If we go back to Germany, yes, Germany now is the biggest industry and economy in Europe. It looks like German should play a more active role to support this strategic autonomy and to deal with defensive autonomy or some other. But unfortunately, politically and military, German side still had a lot of dependence on so-called transatlantic relations. That's the reality. So that's also the consequences why at this moment, German side have to take a closer, side with the United States on this, Iran and the Middle East issue. So frankly, I think another big problem is, yes, principle is there, but how could we find out a way to narrow down the gap between the principle and the reality? I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cui. And then Dr. Yan. So you have the floor.
So be short.
Okay.
Talking about China's role in the Russian-Ukraine war, I think there's much expectation on China, largely due to China's relationship and partnership with Russia. But I have to emphasize that this war has also put China in a very difficult position. China needs to strike a balance between China-Russia relations, China and EU relations in the broader context of China-US strategic competition. So I think China has tried its best to, strike a balance between these different triangles. I mean, China, EU, Russia, and China, US, and EU. These two triangles at play. And I think China is also a victim of this war, largely. So I think it is in China's interest to end this war as soon as possible. That's why I think China has also been working on conflict resolution from the very beginning. And I think China is willing to play a more constructive role. But the problem is that I think the timing for China's not a direct party, and I think from a Chinese perspective, how this war will go on and how this war will be ended will largely depends on the US and Europe as well. Europe has a much larger agency in this war in the context of Donald Trump administration. So I think the problem is, when could China play a role? I think the time has not come for China to play a very significant role in this war. But I think if we look into the longer term, when it comes to reconstruction, I think there's a larger role for China to play. And we see already China has recently announced to provide humanitarian energy aid to Ukraine. I think that's telling of the China-Ukraine relationship and what kind of role China could play in the reconstruction of Ukraine. And also, of course, this reconstruction has to be backed up by a credible security guarantee in Ukraine as well, if there is a ceasefire being reached. And again, in that regard, I think China is open to discussions. And with this kind of discussions is badly needed between China and Europe, which I agree with Professor Cui as well. Okay, Mr. Yang.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Thank you. So just now I saw Andrew raised his hand. So do you still have anything to say?
Just very briefly, because I think I was trying to differentiate in my input between supporters of the Russian war in Ukraine and tacit supporters, right? And I see China as a tacit supporter. I accept the claim for different also geopolitical reasons that the Chinese take a neutral position, right? And if you take a neutral position, you can still, of course, deal with the country economically. You can buy its oil. You can sell dual-used goods. But our problem is not so much in the exchange of goods or in the eventuality of Chinese drones landing up in Russia. It's the very open legitimization which Beijing, in our perspective, lends to Russia's war on Ukraine by putting Putin on the stage, by inviting Putin, by giving the impression on the level of state leaders meetings that there is a very strong kind of geopolitical axis forming between China and Russia, and by promoting the Russian narrative of this war as a war against a NATO which encroaches on others' territories and spheres of influence. This is a major problem, especially because it is receptive to countries in the global south, right? And I just think that this is a major something which might from the Chinese side not look as too consequential, but from our point of view, this tacit support by one of the leading major powers in the world now to the Russian war effort is a problem. It's a tacit support.
Okay, thank you. So it's very good to have always, diverging views to there's a debate. So it's really very good. So, but it also demonstrates that.
May I have the last sentence? Yes, please.
Okay,
yes,
yeah,
I understand what Andrew mentioned, that your real concern. But now I think that now you mentioned that the global south. If we go back to the origin, why there is a global south concept or situation, it shows that European stance or attitude is not a universal one. Okay, because you find out, yes, there are some diversity of international community on this Ukrainian crisis. So why don't you accept that China should have its own stand? You always try to force China go back to or close to your stand. And also the last year.
No. I mean, I accept this as a fact as an analyst, but I'm saying it's detrimental. It's detrimental to the European position on this war. This is a fact. It's not in our interest.
Yes.
Whereas I accept, of course, China makes its own choices, obviously, and it can do so. But nevertheless, it doesn't change the fact that it's detrimental to our interests. Yeah?
I think the Chinese attitude. Yes, China's attitude. It's clear as possible.
It's an obstacle to our cooperation. Okay. I'm also for a more intense cooperation between Europe and China, but this is an obstacle to this. To stronger, to improved cooperation. It is. One cannot decouple geostrategic from geoeconomic issues. It's impossible.
Yes. I think now, so far, the consensus between us, yes, Ukraine issue become an obstacle between China and Europe, right? But now, how to say, the following step is, if we try to deal with it or not, if we try to change the situation and to deal with the obstacle, I think just like I mentioned, we should be sat down and have a serious discussion, especially, when Minister Wang visited Brussels last time, I think China showed its a real consideration about this issue, which means that, okay, if it's possible, China change its attitude or policy, but how could Europe provide some help to, for Chinese security environment? So far still, China is facing very, very big pressures from Washington for this long-time competition or even confrontation. So how could Europe do something to help China? I think it's not a transaction, but indeed it's a partnership. So once there is not, any, actions or any desire from European side to help China, so how could you convince China to help you? I think that's a very, very big problem. So I think I have a final conclusion is, finally, I think it could be China and Europe. We will be decisive factors to finish the war in Ukraine. Why? because just like you mentioned, now China is supporting Russia, and the European Union and Europe is supporting Ukraine, right? So once we try to, especially between China and Europe, we have some more discussion, we have even some consensus on this issue. We can do something together. They can try to help the, destination of the situation. Maybe now it's not the United States, it's not some other. I think finally it could be China and Europe. We can do something together.
Actually, I think this is really what needs to happen. This is why such talks like this one really help, and we should have this much more often, because there is, instead of, or in comparison or in contrast to the relationship between the US and Europe, the transatlantic relationship, here there's not much of an ecosystem for 1.5 or 2.0 exchanges, So we should make this more substantial in order to build trust in the first instance, and this events help, and this governance.
Can I follow up? Can I follow up? One just very short.
Okay, just one or two sentences.
Yes, because I forgot to mention this point as well. As I mentioned, I think China is willing, and it is in China's interest to end this war, and China is willing to play a more constructive role in that regard. But why? But it depends, because I think China itself alone, cannot, end this war. And I think from China's perspective, U.S. position is pretty clear now. But then I think that the variable, the most important variable, it's Europe. And for China, I think there is no clear strategy from the European side.
But what do you mean by constructive, more constructive? I mean, define what you mean by that.
By, sitting on the table and, play more active diplomatic role to talk about, the arrangements or the ceasefire or arrangements after the ceasefire or, the European or new security architecture. I think China is willing to be part of that process. But I think,
European leaders have made a lot of proposals, so it's not that we don't have a strategy. I think,
yes, the real last sentence. I mean, this constructive, solution from China's perspective is not only just to talk about ceasefire in Ukraine, and we need to connect to this ceasefire issue. Peace agreement, and also the long-time construction of a European security architecture, which means that I think China want to have a look at from European side. There will be a comprehensive and also structural, solutions, especially starting from how could Europe to deal with its relations with Russia. Personally, I think as we know now, the big problem for every side, every stakeholder is lack of mutual confidence. So indeed, I think once there's a long-time solutions, constructive solutions, there will be a necessary process of confidence building between Europe and Russia personally. And once something happens that way, I think China could, and there will be more space. There will be more willing from China to play
it's
more.
It's very difficult because we were betrayed several times by the Russians already. It's and I think I see it as a very hard task in Putin's lifetime to rebuild trust between Brussels and Moscow, to be honest.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, it could not happen in a so-called bilateral approach. We should have a trilateral way. We should have a trilateral way. Let's imagine that once something happens in future, there will be a negotiation or discussion between China, Europe, and Russia. I think that would be very, very helpful for this confidence building process. But once there are some more bilateral, undoubtedly there will be more and more, this, negative, because when China and Russia, they have bilateral discussion, there will be more suspicion from the European side. And the same situation will happen. Once China have negotiation only with Europe, there will be suspicion from Russia. So finally, we need to find out a trilateral discussion. And I think only on this way, we can find out a very comprehensive solution indeed.
Okay, thank you for the speakers. So I think this is a very hot debate, and it's always good for a moderator to see that this debate from the speakers, because that make our discussion more lively and also more insightful. And I also agree with Andre that this is really, indicates the need for us to conduct more communications on these issues, because I think that's kind of a different approaches from European side and Chinese side on this issue. And also it reflects the certain different positions both sides are facing. So I think there are more need to have this kind of dialogue. I think we have already been behind time, so that maybe there's no time for Q&A. But I see there's also a debate is going on in the chat box, so which is I think is very good. But anyway, thank you for all the speakers today and for all the participants for your attention. And my takeaway for this from this discussion is that I think really today we set up a lot of questions, which some of them were briefly touched upon, but needs further deliberation discussion. For example, actually, when the Chinese speakers are stressing the kind of a more long-term strategic aspect of the current security challenges, and the European speakers are more like looking at the stressing or the pressing need to solve the current issues. So, but surely I think that there might be some consensus or agreement between these two approaches, but still we need some more dialogues and communications on that. So that ICS will facilitate this kind of communication, and also we rely upon the cooperation with both our European speakers and also Chinese speakers to push that discussion forward and try to bridge the differences and try to detect the problems that need further debate and discussion. Okay, so thank you very much. And again, I look forward to meeting you soon, either in person or online. Thank you.